Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's September 27th, 2025. It might be time for us to switch our nom de guerres from Ness and Jeff to Apple Kid and Orange Kid, respectively. Though the neoliberal establishment is hardly keen on Charlie Kirk, or was hardly keen on Charlie Kirk, they do not want a Bane to bring vengeance and righteous judgment against the MAGA forces and the elite insurgency that has aligned with it. One element of the Kirk assassination we haven't covered much here, if at all, is that there is a strong class, and to use a Marxist term, power dynamic at play here that is reflective in the way that different factions of the political landscape have treated the Charlie Kirk assassination, namely the managerial elites who are opposed to what Charlie Kirk stood for and what the MAGA movement largely represents are not supportive of the John Brown Bolshevik style of perceived justice being delivered by inscribed bullet. That's the sort of chaos that can spin out of control quite quickly, and there is no benefit in ruling over the rubble. Understandably, much of the mainstream right has tried to create the perception that there is widespread support among all elements of the left, broadly defined, for what happened to Charlie Kirk. But that is not an accurate assessment. Again, it's an understandable one for polemical purposes, for political purposes and rhetorical purposes, but there is a stark contrast between the grassroots left, the managerial aspirants, you might call them, and the people who actually have power and have the capability to shape the culture and the way that the culture perceives of things. And this is a split on the left that is playing out in the wake of the Kirk assassination. Almost no one in power is mocking Kirk's death, and the few ill-advised ones who did so, like Matthew Dowd most prominently, were punished immediately for it. Jimmy Kimmel, incidentally, he didn't mock Kirk. He asserted that the killer was MAGA and that Trump didn't take it seriously, which parenthetically is a fair criticism. I'm hardly offering a novel insight when I point out that Donald Trump very much struggles in any situation where he is not the center of attention. And for someone like Charlie Kirk to, for however briefly, become the most talked about person in America is something tough for Trump to accept. And particularly when he is asked directly about it, just as when he's asked about almost anything, it is hard for Trump not to turn the question around in some way to put himself at the center of the question. But Kimmel is savvy enough and has enough legitimate sense of self-preservation not to explicitly mock Kirk or make light of the way that he went out or poke fun at his widowed wife and orphaned children. One of the reasons for the reticence among the ruling elite to not make light of or encourage or in any way really be perceived to be celebrating what happened to Kirk is because as elites, as people of prominence, the aphorism, "but for the grace of God go I," is quite applicable in a very visceral way. Although we are entering an era where political acts of violence are going to be on the uptick and continue to increase, we are nowhere near the level of politically influenced terrorism that characterized the United States in the mid-late 60s and early 70s. And if we get to that point, it's not just going to be United healthcare CEOs and prominent Republican or conservative opinion makers who are going to meet the business end of some disaffected nihilist's grievance. Speaking of Jimmy Kimmel, he is back on the air, which means that the FCC threat from Brendan Carr was perceived by ABC to be empty. Sinclair and Nexstar, the two biggest ABC affiliates in the country, however, are not picking Kimmel back up. So if the threat is real, then there is the added strength of major corporate conglomerates agreeing, at least putatively, with the reasons behind the threat that the FCC issued. It could be that Sinclair and Nexstar are just using the blow-up as a pretext to do what we talked about last week and drop the dead weight of a too expensive and not remunerative enough late night show. But if that's the case, then it's all the more reason for the FCC and for the Trump administration to go after ABC for brushing off Carr's threat to do it the hard way if the network doesn't voluntarily do it the easy way, because ABC at this point is effectively standing alone with their two biggest affiliates not standing by them. And so if the FCC and the Trump administration won't take this one to the mat, then it seems risible that they're going to go after any of their enemy power centers in a meaningful way. If the dog and pony show about Kimmel going off the air for a few days, for a weekend essentially, and then enjoying the highest ratings his show has probably ever seen, certainly has seen in the last decade, which was the case with the night he came back, if that is the punitive consequences that are visited on him and the network for the commentary that the FCC deemed to be effectively criminal, potentially deserving of being taken off the air, and what comes out of it is nothing, that Kimmel is allowed to continue on ABC, the Trump administration and the FCC bluff will have been totally called. And so it seems like the gauntlet has been thrown down here by ABC. We'll see if the Trump administration shows up at high noon or folds. I suspect it will be the latter. Charlie Kirk became famous by visiting college campuses and having open back and forths with college students and faculty, and Turning Point USA became, over the better part of the last decade, became the largest conservative activist group on college campuses across the country. And that is no mean feat. He did what Young Americans for Liberty and the Leadership Institute and Heritage and Cato and these other well-funded, long-established, allegedly right-of-center groups in the imperial capital centered in D.C. were unable to do or unwilling to do for generations. Charlie Kirk came and ate their lunch. That said, I think there is a tendency among his supporters to overemphasize the importance and influence he had among younger Americans. Looking at an Economist YouGov poll from this week asking about favorability by age cohort, we get 23% of Zoomers, those aged between 18 and 29, having a favorable opinion of Charlie Kirk, 31% of millennials, 40% of Xers, and 41% of boomers expressing a favorable opinion of Charlie Kirk. And so the favorable opinion of Charlie Kirk is twice as high among boomers as it is among Zoomers. While Turning Point USA has undoubtedly made some impact on college campuses, its viability as an ongoing organization was driven largely by donor money, and that funding and the people who were providing it were and continue to be largely older Americans. Questions about the veracity of exactly what happened that led to Charlie Kirk's death, in terms of whether or not the narrative as it is, or as it has been presented officially, with the lone shooter employing a high-powered rifle from hundreds of yards away, the Trump administration and the right in general have done a pretty subpar job in communicating that most people don't read beyond the headlines, if they even read that far. And so Kimmel's assertion that the shooter was a MAGA man, even several weeks after the incident, still has quite a bit of purchase. Pulling from the same Economist YouGov poll to the question, quote, do you think that the person who killed Charlie Kirk was mostly motivated by ellipsis, unquote, only 31% of respondents chose left-wing beliefs. It's difficult to suss out how much of this is a consequence of people simply not believing the official story as presented to them and having questions about if there was a person or people closer who were firing via a small pistol being concealed on account of the miraculous case of there being no exit wound, which from a high-powered rifle shot several hundred yards away, it strains credulity to think that it would enter and not exit. And in fact, a spokesman for Turning Point USA characterized that salient's lack of an exit wound as, quote, even in death, Charlie managed to save the lives of those around him. Remarkable, miraculous, unquote. But outside of Candace Owens, that's not getting a lot of mainstream attention, and so to self-reference back to the observation that many people don't read behind the headlines if they even read that far, to most people that is going to be off their radar. And so I suspect that most of the respondents of a public poll like this believe that the shooter who has been identified officially is the one who done it. And yet, even with the FBI officially reporting that the shooting suspect was in a romantic relationship with a tranny, and one of the engraved bullets read, quote, "Hey fascist, catch," unquote. Despite this, fewer than 1 in 3 Americans report believing that he was mostly motivated by left-wing beliefs. And 15%, so 1 in 8, believe he was motivated by right-wing beliefs. Another 22% saying something other than political beliefs, and the residual 32% saying that they are not sure. And so while I do think that this is a galvanizing incident for a significant portion of the right in America, it is setting up to go down as high-profile instance of political and cultural violence that is indicative of a fracturing and increasingly militant culture, but not as a clear-cut instance of left-wing terrorism. And so I think that also bodes poorly for the prospects of the Red Caesar, Stephen Miller-driven effort to use this as the catalyst for a sustained and serious legal assault on organizations and individuals outing themselves as celebrants of violence and destruction being brought on Heritage America by outfits like Antifa and the John Brown Gun Club, of which there is significant overlap. The Kirk assassination doesn't just raise the question of left-wing violence, of course. Erica Kirk, Charlie's widow, generated a lot of discussion on the right for her offering of forgiveness to the killer of her late husband.
My husband, Charlie, he wanted to save young men, just like the one who took his life. That young man, on the cross, our Savior said, "Father, forgive them, for they not know what they do. That man, that young man, I forgive him. I forgive him because it was what Christ did and is what Charlie would do. The answer to hate is not hate. The answer we know from the gospel is love, and always love. Love for our enemies and love for those who persecute us.
That delivery is clearly emotionally felt, obviously, and even though it is scripted, literally, she's reading from a teleprompter, she still garbles the most emphatic line, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." And that isn't meant as a criticism of her, but instead as evidence that she is moved by the message, and this is something that she deeply feels. Her reading is not incorrect per se, but it is incomplete from a Christian perspective. And of course, a grieving widow is permitted to hold on to and emphasize whatever she needs to find the strength to carry on in the face of unimaginable, almost unimaginable adversity that has been thrust upon her with what has happened to her family. But I say her rendering is incomplete because the conception of forgiveness invoked here runs the risk, I think, of being conflated with amnesty or exoneration or something like that. But that is not what forgiveness means, certainly not from a secular perspective. In some sense, yes, all of humanity since the fall is guilty of a sort of sin, an original sin, that there is nothing that any person is able to do on their own to wipe away that sin. It is the sacrifice of Jesus, and only the sacrifice of Jesus, that is able to forgive that ultimate original sin. But that does not in any way exonerate or offer an amnesty devoid of consequence for the sinner. From the 23rd chapter of the Gospel of Luke, verses 32 through 43, quote, "Two others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, they were crucified, and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, 'Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.' And they cast lots to divide his garments, and the people stood by watching. But the ruler scoffed at him, saying, 'He saved others, let him save himself. If he is the Christ of God, his chosen one.' The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, 'If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself.' There was also an inscription over him, 'This is the King of the Jews.' One of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, 'Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us.' But the other rebuked him, saying, 'Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation, and we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong.' And he said, 'Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom.' And Jesus said to him, 'Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise.'" Unquote. The thief, dying next to Jesus in the most excruciating and humiliating way imaginable, was receiving justice, and it wasn't some sort of corrupted or undeserved justice. In fact, it was the most just justice. And Jesus, dying on the cross, underscored just how correct that dying thief's observation was that he was receiving what he was due for the actions that he had taken in this world, and understanding that only through repentance and the grace of God was he able to make it to paradise in the afterlife. The thief was given forgiveness and capital punishment, because those two things are not inherently at odds. To the contrary, often justice demands that consequences, secular consequences, be suffered by those who do evil things. Indeed, this is made clear from the beginning, from Genesis chapter 9, verse 5. And I will require the blood of anyone who takes another person's life. If a wild animal kills a person, it must die, and anyone who murders a fellow human must die. To the protestation, but that's the Old Testament God, not the New Testament, nice, loving Jesus, from Matthew 5, verse 17. Quote, this is Jesus speaking, quote, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them," unquote. In the Beatitudes on the Sermon on the Mount, the most well-known of Jesus's direct teachings, he recounts the parables of the talents and ends in Luke chapter 19, verse 27, "But bring here those enemies of mine who did not want me to reign over them, and slay them before me." Again, from the Gospels, this is Matthew chapter 10, verse 34. Again, Jesus' own words. "Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." And so the idea that there can be love without justice, which is a crucial element of what makes love love, is incomplete. It's false. There cannot be love without justice. It is something else. It is satanic. It is demonic to have love that does not incorporate justice. It can be hoped, it should be hoped for by Christians, that the killer ultimately receives forgiveness when he is reconciled with his Creator. But Scripture is quite clear that it is the duty of Christians to send him to his Maker post haste, not with bloodlust and certainly not with glee, but firmly and unapologetically. Moving on from Charlie Kirk directly to an issue that his legacy will inextricably be tied up with, the question of Israel and its actions in the Middle East against the Palestinians. We are on the cusp of an inversion in terms of expressed American support for the Palestinians over the Israelis. Immediately following October 7th, Americans overwhelmingly expressed more support and sympathy for the Israelis over the Palestinians. But after a year of the Israeli response, the sentiments of Americans had settled to where they were prior to the Hamas attack on October 7th of 2023. And it looked like maybe that is where they would settle, at more than a 2-to-1 ratio in favor of the Israelis. But in the subsequent year, following that first year of Israel's response, expressed sympathies for the Israelis and against the Palestinians did not settle. They continued to decline in the case of the Israelis and rise in the case of the Palestinians, such that this most recent iteration of the question asking respondents if they sympathize more with the Israelis or the Palestinians, sympathies are almost exactly evenly split, with 28% of Americans saying they sympathize more with the Israelis and 25% saying that they sympathize more with the Palestinians, so almost at parity, with 22% saying they sympathize equally and 24% saying they're not sure. Outside of Israel itself, there is scarcely a country on the face of the earth where the public is more supportive of Israel and the Israeli cause than the United States. And so when the American public has turned on Israel, there are no longer any publics anywhere in the world that at least a majority or even a plurality are supportive of the Israeli cause over the Palestinian one. How much that matters is a different question, because what the grassroots in any country wants and what the ruling establishment is determined to get are often tenuously related at best and sometimes bear no correlation at all, or if they do, their correlation is inverse. But it is still a noteworthy development, and it is one that helps explain the urgency, the stridency, and the explicitness of many Jewish elites in being very forthright about their concerns and their desires and the urgency with which they are advocating for them. In the case of Larry Ellison, the very pro-Israel Jewish founder of Oracle and one of the richest men in the world, taking a controlling share in TikTok to pair with his control of the legacy media, as he also owns CBS News and Paramount being the entertainment studio responsible for Titanic and Top Gun and Transformers, Shrek, Mission Impossible, Indiana Jones, Forrest Gump. If we're in an InfoWars world, the largest private donor to the IDF in the history of the world, owning TikTok and CBS and Paramount, is well positioned in that unfolding information war. But that urgency is also manifesting in other ways. Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, voiced a very reasonable, sober, and existential concern about the identity group he belongs to and the one that ultimately motivates much of what he does.
Is it your sense that Jewish people are getting complacent, that they're not engaging to degrees and levels we should be?
I have met a lot of October 8th Jews for whom the massacre on October 7th was a wake-up call. I've met a lot of people who feel much more galvanized, much more organized. But that will only be sustained if we offer them, ways to participate in a real and robust way in Jewish life.
Mm-hmm. And whose responsibility is that?
All of ours.
Yeah.
But this is why we need a revolution in our community on so many levels. So look, the reality is that intermarriage rates continue to go up. Assimilation continues apace. And look, I fight anti-Semitism. That is my job. Right. But I worry a great deal about broader questions of Jewish identity, as I think we talked about over lunch.
If anything, he is understating the severity of the problem that Jews face in the Western world. Jewish outmarriage among the non-Orthodox from 2010 to the present is a staggering 72%. That means almost 3 in 4 of non-Orthodox Jews, and Orthodox Jews comprise less than 10% of the American Jewish population. That percentage is growing for reasons that Jonathan Greenblatt is alluding to here, but the Orthodox represent a small minority of the total Jewish population, and with nearly 3 in 4 Jews marrying non-Jews, Jewishness is quite literally being bred out of existence in the West. To put that stark figure in context, in the 1960s, just a couple of generations ago, it was only 10% of Jews in America marrying non-Jews. And that was at a point in time when the Jewish share of the population was actually a little bit smaller than it is now. Additionally, from the General Social Survey from 2000 onward to the present, the Jewish total fertility rate in the United States is 1.49 children, so well below the 2.1 children required for population replacement, let alone population increase. And so if 3 out of 4 Jews are marrying non-Jews, and even those Jews who are marrying other Jews are having Jewish babies well below replacement level, what is striking here is not that Greenblatt is mentioning this problem, but that it has taken Jewish organizations so long to publicize what should be a major concern. If instead of calling heritage Americans who have the same concerns about heritage America bigots and racists and white nationalists and white supremacists and anti-Semites for expressing the same concerns about their identity and the viability of it in the future if instead of all of that, Greenblatt instead embraced those concerns as being indicative of a shared struggle that Jewish Americans also faced. There could be a seismic reconfiguration of the political landscape in the United States. Perhaps we are still a long, maybe and impossibly a long distance from that ever occurring, but it looks and sounds a lot more plausible now than it would have 3 years ago, let alone 30 years ago. And it should be a concern among Jews, but also among Gentiles. In fact, it is a huge problem with modernity for all people touched by it. From the General Social Survey, by decade, the percentages of American adults under the age of 40, so those between the ages of 18 and 39, who were married. In the 1970s, 58% of Americans under the age of 40 were married. In the 80s, it had dropped to 52%. In the 90s, to 48%. In the aughts, the first decade of the 2000s, to 42%. In the teens, in the 2010s, to 36%. And now in the 2020s to just 33%. So from well over half of young adults being married in the 1970s to just 1 in 3 being married today. And even as an increasing percentage of births are out of wedlock, still the strongest predictor by far of fertility is marital status. As marriage rates continue to decline, so does fertility. Family formation is on a seemingly unrectifiable path to exile. And I want to close off by talking about a subject that Jeff and I will delve more deeply into from a philosophical and religious and cultural set of perspectives. But now I want to primarily look at the consequences of changing attitudes on an issue related to family formation, and that is the question of same-sex marriage and how the acceptance and celebration even of it has corresponded with that drop in marriage rates and fertility and family formation discussed just now. The General Social Survey first asked about support for same-sex marriage in 1988, and then went on a couple-decade hiatus before asking about the question again in 2006, and then every subsequent iteration of the survey has asked about it since, and that is because the issue became a particularly salient one during the mid-2000s. It's quite propitious for historical comparison purposes that the General Social Survey thought to ask about the question in 1988, because up until that point it was perceived as such a fringe issue that it almost wasn't even worth inquiring about. And we can see that from the results of that 1988 General Social Survey, when 25% of self-described liberals supported the idea of same-sex marriage, just 10% of moderates and 10% of conservatives did in 1988. When the issue had become front and center of the culture wars in 2006, some 66% of liberals said that they supported same-sex marriage. 41% of moderates did, and 24% of conservatives. So by 2006, the conservative position had become the liberal position of 1988. Keeping these numbers in your head in an audio cast can be tricky, but recall that in 1988, 25% of liberals said that they supported same-sex marriage. In 2006, 24% of conservatives did. The quip about today's American political conservatism always being yesterday's American political liberalism exists and resonates for a reason, or it exists for a whole bunch of reasons, and this is one of them. From 2006 through to today, support for same-sex marriage among all political orientations, liberals, moderates, and conservatives, continued to increase. such that for 2022, the last year that we have publicly available full data for the General Social Survey, 92% of liberals said that they supported same-sex marriage. 84% of moderates did, and 57%, so a strong majority of self-described conservatives said that they supported same-sex marriage. And so a cultural war issue that enjoyed minority support, if not fringe support, among those on the left in the late 80s, now enjoys a majority support among those on the right in 2022, just a generation on. As for how redefining marriage to include those of the same sex marrying one another undermines the teleology of marriage, which is ultimately family formation and the propagation and viability of the species. That is something Jeff and I will flesh out in detail in the future. But one obvious pillar of marriage that granting it to same-sex individuals undermines is that of monogamy. Heterosexual marriage, that is to say, marriage, has been perceived in the Western world as a monogamous institution, at least in its ideal form and what it aspired to. And even in the 21st century, that is generally the way that it is perceived. But that is under threat now in no small part to the expanding of the definition of marriage in the West to include members of the same sex. From the General Social Survey, the percentages who have cheated on a spouse by sexual orientation. So this is the percentages of people by sexual orientation who have had sex with someone other than their spouse while they were married, not upon separation or prior to marriage, but while being married. Among heterosexuals, 15%. Among homosexuals, 35%, and among those who are bisexual, 43%. And though the T part of the alphabet soup acronym is not inquired about, presumably the percentages of extramarital activity is even higher there. So we have a situation where the LGBT plus crew is 3 times as likely to have sex outside of marriage as heterosexuals are. There is also, of course, a religious element to marriage. And so it comes as little surprise that as religiosity has declined, so have marriage rates and so has family formation and fertility. And in part, due to that religious grounding, opposition to same-sex marriage is stronger among the religious than the irreligious. It is similarly not surprising that as religiosity has declined, so has opposition to same-sex marriage. To reiterate, disentangling the cause and effect here is a Herculean task, but the empirical reality on the ground, how things are manifesting in the real world, is something we can measure. And when it comes to fertility from 2000 onward, from the General Social Survey, by religious affiliation, we see Protestants at 1.97 total children, Catholics at 1.91. So even when it comes to the 2 largest strains of the Christian faith in the West, fertility, even among professed Christians, is below replacement, albeit not far below replacement. As aforementioned, among Jews, it is 1.49. Among those who have no religious affiliation whatsoever, 1.40. And among those with some other religious affiliations, a largely Hindu or Buddhist or other mystic tradition, it is at 1.44. As all the things that historically have correlated positively with family formation decline, marriage, religiosity, non-heterosexuality as deviancy, decline as well. That strikes me as a decline in the fortunes of the Occident, of the Western world, but others view that as progress. And so on that happy note, we'll end it for this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.